I was invited to dinner by my wife's uncle, the CEO, and his family, only to be told I was being replaced by his 20-year-old son after building the company from scratch. Time to step aside, you're just a dropout. We picked from the trash, he said. I smiled and replied, completely understand. They had no idea that I. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, handwritten on cream-colored stationery with the Harrington family crest embossed in gold at the top. Margaret had handed it to me with that particular smile she reserves for her family, equal parts pride and apology, though she'd never admit to the latter. Uncle Richard wants us at the estate for dinner Saturday, she said. He says it's important. I was elbow deep in schematics at the time, working through a supply chain problem that had kept me up 3 nights running. The new manufacturing facility in Vietnam was hemorrhaging money, and I'd finally traced the issue to a mid-level manager who'd been padding invoices for 18 months. I remember looking up from the papers spread across my desk, blinking in the afternoon light that streamed through my office window. Important how? Margaret shrugged. You know, Uncle Richard, everything's important when it involves the company. I knew Richard Harrington better than my wife imagined. 12 years of building his company into something that actually functioned had given me ample opportunity to study the man. He was 63 years old, carried himself with the practiced ease of old money, and had never worked a day in his life that didn't involve a golf club or a boardroom chair his father had placed him in. The company, Harrington Industrial Solutions, had been a modest regional supplier of industrial components when I first walked through its doors. Richard had inherited it from his father, who'd inherited it from his father, and so on back to some ancestor who'd actually possessed the ambition and intelligence the subsequent generations seemed to have diluted into nothing. Saturday works, I said, returning to my papers. Tell him we'll be there at 7. I should explain how I came to be married to Margaret Harrington and how I came to be the man who transformed her family's company from a dying relic into a $2 billion enterprise. The two stories are intertwined, but not in the way most people assume. I dropped out of college at 19. Not because I was stupid or lazy, but because my mother was dying of pancreatic cancer and someone needed to pay the bills. My father had left when I was 7, just walked out one morning and never came back, so it fell to me. I worked 3 jobs for 2 years: overnight stock at a grocery store, weekend shifts at an auto body shop, and weekday afternoons doing data entry for a company that processed insurance claims. My mother died anyway, of course. Cancer doesn't care how hard you work. After she was gone, I had nothing. No degree, no family, no prospects. What I did have was a mind that wouldn't stop working. During those data entry shifts, I'd started noticing patterns in the claims, inefficiencies in how the company processed information, bottlenecks that cost them thousands of hours annually. I wrote a proposal, just for something to do, outlining how they could restructure their workflow. I never showed it to anyone, but I kept writing proposals, kept analyzing systems, kept teaching myself everything I could about operations and logistics and the hidden machinery that makes businesses either thrive or slowly bleed out. I was 23 when I walked into Harrington Industrial Solutions looking for a job. Any job. I would have swept floors. Instead, they put me in the warehouse, tracking inventory. Within 6 months, I'd identified $340,000 in annual losses due to mismanaged stock rotation. I wrote a report. This time, I showed it to someone, a middle manager named Phil who didn't know what to do with it, so he passed it up the chain until it landed on Richard Harrington's desk. Richard called me into his office on a Thursday afternoon. I remember the way he looked at me, this kid in a warehouse uniform standing in his wood-paneled sanctuary surrounded by portraits of his ancestors. You wrote this? He asked, holding up my report. Yes, sir. It's not bad. He set it down. You have a degree in this? Business? Operations? No, sir. I dropped out of state after my freshman year. Something flickered in his eyes then. I know now it was the first calculation, the realization that he could use me without ever having to treat me as an equal. A dropout from nowhere, no connections, no leverage, the perfect tool. I'm going to give you an opportunity, he said. Don't waste it. I didn't. Margaret came into my life 3 years later. By then, I'd restructured the entire warehouse operation, renegotiated contracts with 4 major suppliers, and increased the company's profit margin by 18%. Richard had promoted me twice, though always with titles that kept me safely below the executive level. Senior Operations Coordinator, Director of Logistics. Words that meant everything and nothing. Margaret was 26, recently returned from a master's program in art history that she'd never use. She was beautiful in the way wealthy people often are, the kind of beauty that comes from never having worried about anything. Good skin, good teeth, clothes that fit perfectly because they'd been tailored to fit perfectly. She wandered into my office one afternoon looking for her uncle and found me instead. "You're the miracle worker," she said, leaning against my doorframe. "Uncle Richard talks about you at dinner parties. My secret weapon, he calls you." I should have heard the warning in those words. Secret weapon. Things you use and put away, things you never acknowledge publicly. "I'm just good with numbers," I said. She smiled. "I'm terrible with numbers. Maybe you can teach me." We were married 14 months later. Richard walked her down the aisle. Her father had died when she was 12, and I remember the way he shook my hand afterward, firm and proprietary. "You're family now," he said. "That means something." I believed him. That was my mistake. The years that followed blur together in my memory, not because they were unremarkable, but because I was so immersed in the work that I lost track of time passing. I became, without anyone ever officially acknowledging it, the person who ran Harrington Industrial Solutions. Richard remained CEO, and of course, he signed the checks and gave the speeches and took the meetings with investors. But every decision of consequence came through me first. Every crisis landed on my desk. Every innovation, every expansion, every strategic pivot, mine. I took a regional supplier of industrial components and turned it into a global logistics company. I opened offices in Singapore, Sao Paulo, Munich. I developed proprietary software for supply chain management that our competitors tried to reverse engineer for years. I built relationships with manufacturers in 12 countries, relationships based on my word and my handshake, relationships that existed because they trusted me specifically. Through it all, I remained director of operations, then vice president of operations, always the back room, always the machine that ran the machine. Richard promoted his nephew to chief marketing officer. His wife's brother became CFO. His college roommate's son got a VP title for a division that existed mainly on paper. The family took the glory. I did the work. I didn't mind. I told myself I didn't mind. The work itself was reward enough. The satisfaction of solving problems, of building something that functioned, of watching an idea become reality. And I had Margaret, who loved me in her way, who gave me 2 children I adored, who never questioned why her uncle treated me like hired help at family gatherings. Or maybe I did mind, somewhere deep down. Maybe I'd been minding for years, collecting small wounds that never quite healed. The way Richard introduced me to investors as our operations guy. The way his wife, Patricia, asked me to check on the caterers during family events. The way that Harrington cousins talked about the company Richard built as if I'd never existed. I learned to smile through it. I learned to nod and say the right things and retreat to my office where the work waited, where I could lose myself in problems that had solutions. By the time that cream-colored invitation arrived, I'd been running Harrington Industrial Solutions for 12 years. The company was worth $2 billion. We employed 4,000 people across 3 continents, and Richard's son, Thomas, had just turned 20. I'd watched Thomas grow up at the edges of family gatherings, a sullen teenager who played video games during dinner, a mediocre student who'd scraped through prep school on his family name, a young man who'd never held a job or shown interest in anything beyond his trust fund. Richard doted on him with the blind adoration of a man who sees his own legacy in his offspring, regardless of whether any such legacy actually exists. Thomas had started working at the company 6 months earlier. I use quotation marks because his job consisted primarily of having a corner office, a secretary, and a title, Junior Director of Strategic Initiatives. That meant absolutely nothing. He came in around 11 most days, left by 3, and spent the interim browsing social media and taking long lunches. I knew this because I knew everything that happened in that building. It was my job to know. I should have seen what was coming. The signs were there if I'd been willing to look. Richard scheduling more meetings that excluded me. Patricia's questions at family dinners about my retirement plans. The way Thomas had started attending board meetings, sitting in a chair someone had placed for him beside his father. But I didn't want to see. I was 51 years old, I'd given everything to that company, and I still believed, foolishly, desperately, That merit mattered. That 12 years of results would count for something. That they would look at me and see what I'd built, not what I was. A dropout they'd picked from the trash. Saturday arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of autumn day that makes you want to stay inside with a book and a fire. Margaret spent 2 hours getting ready, emerging from our bedroom in a burgundy dress that cost more than my mother had earned in a month. "You're wearing that?" she asked, eyeing my charcoal suit. "What's wrong with it?" "Nothing. I just thought, it's Uncle Richard. Maybe something more formal." I should have heard the warning in that too, the subtle pressure to dress for something important. But I just smiled and told her I looked fine, and we drove through the rain to the Harrington estate. The house was a monument to inherited wealth, a Georgian mansion set on 40 acres of manicured grounds, maintained by a staff of 7, decorated with antiques that Richard's grandfather had collected during a lifetime of travels. I'd been there hundreds of times, but I'd never felt at home. The house didn't want me. I was a foreign object in its bloodstream, tolerated but never accepted. Patricia met us at the door, air-kissing Margaret and giving me the sort of smile you'd give a contractor who'd shown up on time. "Everyone's in the drawing room," she said. "Richard has a special announcement." The drawing room was full when we entered. Richard's brother and his wife, their 3 adult children, assorted cousins and spouses. Thomas sat in a leather chair by the fireplace, looking uncomfortable, in a suit that probably cost more than my car, and Richard himself stood at the center of it all, holding a glass of whiskey, radiating the particular smugness of a man about to do something he considers magnanimous. "There he is," Richard boomed when he saw me. "The man of the hour." I felt the attention of the room shift toward me. Margaret squeezed my hand, and I hoped, that perhaps I'd misjudged everything. Perhaps this was a celebration, a promotion, an acknowledgement, finally, of everything I'd done. "Let's eat first," Richard said, gesturing toward the dining room. "Business can wait until we've had Patricia's roast." The meal was interminable. Course after course, wine after wine, conversation that circled around golf handicaps and vacation homes and which private school was best for the next generation of Harringtons. I sat beside Margaret and made the appropriate noises and watched Thomas across the table, picking at his food like a child forced to eat his vegetables. Finally, after dessert had been served and cleared, Richard stood up and tapped his glass with a fork. "Family," he said, "I've asked you all here tonight because I have an announcement. As you know, I've been CEO of Harrington Industrial Solutions for 31 years. It's been the privilege of my life to continue the legacy my father and grandfather began. But I'm not getting any younger, and it's time to start thinking about the future." My heart began to beat faster. This was it. After 12 years, he was finally going to acknowledge. "That's why I'm pleased to announce that, effective January 1st, Thomas will be joining the executive leadership team as Chief Operating Officer." The room erupted in applause. I sat very still. "In this role," Richard continued, "Thomas will be taking over day-to-day management of the company, learning the ropes from the ground up, and positioning himself to eventually succeed me as CEO. Margaret was clapping beside me. Everyone was clapping. Thomas looked up from his plate with an expression that might have been surprise or might have been boredom. It was hard to tell with him. "Of course," Richard said, and his eyes found mine across the table. "This means we'll need to make some adjustments to our current structure. I've asked our friend here to stay on in an advisory capacity through the transition, help Thomas get up to speed." Advisory capacity. The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd been running that company for 12 years, and he was relegating me to advisory capacity while his 20-year-old son, who'd never managed anything more complex than his social media accounts, took my job. "I know this is a big change," Richard continued, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd heard him use with suppliers he was about to lowball. "But I think we can all agree it's time for fresh blood, new ideas, a new generation to carry the Harrington name forward." After the applause died down and people began to drift into smaller conversations, Richard approached me. I was standing by the window, looking out at the rain, trying to compose myself. "Let's talk in my study." Yeah. No, he said. It wasn't a request. The study was where Richard conducted the business he considered too important for the office. Firings mostly, and negotiations with people he wanted to intimidate. I'd been in there perhaps a dozen times over the years, always as an observer, never as the subject. He closed the door behind us and went to his desk, not offering me a seat. I wanted to explain the situation privately, he said, pouring himself another whiskey. He didn't offer me one. I know this might come as a surprise. A surprise. I kept my voice neutral. Thomas is ready. He's been preparing for this his whole life. Thomas has been with the company for 6 months. He's never run so much as a lemonade stand. Richard's expression hardened. He's a Harrington. This company is his birthright. His birthright. I repeated the word like I was testing its weight. And what about the work? The 12 years I've spent building. You've done good work, Richard interrupted. No one's disputing that, but let's be honest here. He set down his glass and looked at me with something that might have been pity, might have been contempt. You're an operations guy, a technician. You came to us with nothing, a dropout we picked from the trash, frankly, and we gave you opportunities you never would have had otherwise. You married my niece, for God's sake. You've lived well beyond your means for over a decade. I'd say you've done pretty well out of this arrangement. The trash. He'd actually said it. After everything I'd built, everything I'd sacrificed, he still saw me as garbage he deigned to recycle. So here's what's going to happen, Richard continued. You'll stay on as a consultant for 6 months. Help Thomas learn the systems you've set up. Then you'll retire, quietly, with a generous severance package. Margaret never needs to know the details. We'll say it was your decision, that you wanted to spend more time with the family. I looked at him, this man who'd taken credit for my work for 12 years, who'd introduced me to investors as our operations guy, who'd never once acknowledged that his company would have collapsed into bankruptcy without me. And I smiled. I completely understand, I said. Something flickered in Richard's eyes. Surprise, maybe, that I wasn't fighting. That I wasn't begging or threatening or doing any of the things he'd clearly prepared himself to counter. Good, he said, recovering quickly. I knew you'd be reasonable. You've always been reasonable. It's one of the things I've valued most about you. Valued, like a tool. Like a machine that performed its function without complaint. When would you like me to start the transition? I asked, keeping my voice pleasant, professional. Monday. Thomas will shadow you for the first few weeks. Learn the day-to-day. Of course. I shook his hand. His grip was firm, triumphant, and walked out of the study. Margaret was waiting in the hallway, her face a careful mask. Is everything okay? She asked. Everything's fine, I said. Your uncle and I have come to an understanding. I drove home in silence. Margaret tried to make conversation a few times, but I responded in monosyllables until she gave up and turned on the radio. The rain had stopped, and the wet roads gleamed under the streetlights. They had no idea. That was the thought that kept circling through my mind as I navigated the familiar route home. Richard, Patricia, Thomas, all the Harringtons gathered in that drawing room, clapping for a future they thought they controlled. They had no idea what they'd just done. I should explain. 3 years earlier, I'd started taking precautions, not because I expected this exactly, but because I'd finally admitted to myself that I was building something on sand. The company I'd created existed within a structure that could remove me at any moment, for any reason, with no recourse. I'd seen what happened to people who trusted the Harringtons, the suppliers who'd been dropped without warning, the employees who'd been let go the moment they became inconvenient, the partners who'd been squeezed out of deals they'd helped create. So I began to protect myself. The software I'd developed for supply chain management, I'd kept the core algorithms. The system running at Harrington Industrial Solutions was built on a foundation I owned, licensed to the company through a consulting firm I'd quietly established in my wife's maiden name. Richard had never bothered to read the fine print. He'd just signed whatever contracts I put in front of him, trusting that his operations guy was handling the details. The relationships I'd built with manufacturers, they weren't with Harrington Industrial Solutions. They were with me. Personal connections forged over years of face-to-face meetings, problem-solving, and promises kept. When I called Huang Wei in Shenzhen, or Dmitry Volkov in Moscow, or Sarah Okonkwo in Lagos, they didn't think of Richard Harrington. They thought of the man who'd helped them expand their businesses, who'd always paid on time, who'd treated them like partners rather than subordinates. The contracts I'd negotiated, I'd made sure my signature was on every critical document. Not as a representative of the company, but as an individual guarantor. It was unusual, perhaps, but I'd framed it as personal accountability, and suppliers had appreciated the gesture. What Richard didn't understand was that my departure would trigger review clauses in agreements worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And then there was the Vietnam situation. The manufacturing facility that had been hemorrhaging money, the one with the manager padding invoices. I'd traced those invoices back further than the manager, much further, far enough to find Richard's brother-in-law, Marcus, at the source of a kickback scheme that had been siphoning company funds for years. I had documentation, emails, bank records, shipping manifests with mismatched numbers. I'd been sitting on it for months, trying to decide what to do. Now I knew. I wasn't going to destroy the company. That had never been my intention. I'd built it. I didn't want to see it crumble. But I also wasn't going to let Richard Harrington dismiss me as trash and hand my life's work to his incompetent son without consequence. The consequence wouldn't be revenge. It would be truth. Monday morning, I arrived at the office at my usual time, 6:30 a.m., hours before anyone else. The building was silent, the hallways dark, except for the emergency lighting. I made my way to my office and sat at my desk, looking at the framed photos on the wall. Margaret and the kids at Disney World. My mother, in a photo from before she got sick, laughing at something my father had said. The manufacturing team in Sao Paulo, celebrating when we'd hit our first billion in revenue. I began to pack. Not everything, just the personal items, the things that mattered. I left the awards and the plaques and the corporate commemorations. I took the photos, a pen my mother had given me when I graduated high school, a small Buddha statue a supplier in Thailand had sent me after I'd helped him save his business during a currency crisis. Thomas arrived at 11, as predicted. He wandered into my office looking like he'd just woken up, which he probably had. "So," he said, dropping into a chair without being invited, "how does this work?" "How does what work?" "The job, the operations thing. What do I need to know?" I looked at him, 20 years old, soft around the edges, no calluses on his hands or lines on his face. He'd never lost sleep over a problem he couldn't solve, never felt the weight of 4,000 employees depending on his decisions, never understood what it meant to build something from nothing. "Let me show you the systems," I said. I spent the next 3 weeks walking Thomas through the company, not because Richard had asked me to, but because I wanted to see his son try. I wanted to give him the chance his father had never given me, the chance to prove himself. He couldn't. The supply chain software confused him. The financial models I developed were too complicated. The relationships with manufacturers meant nothing to him. When I tried to arrange calls with key partners, he got bored after 15 minutes and started checking his phone. The manufacturing processes, the quality control systems, the logistics networks I'd spent a decade optimizing. He looked at them the way you might look at a foreign language, with vague recognition that meaning existed somewhere, but no ability to access it. By the end of the 3rd week, I understood something that Richard never would. Thomas wasn't merely unprepared for this job. He was constitutionally incapable of it. Not because he was stupid, he wasn't, but because he had no hunger, no drive, and no reason to push himself beyond mediocrity. And his life had been comfortable since birth, and comfortable was all he wanted. I could have told Richard this. I could have documented Thomas's failures, presented evidence of his inadequacy, made a case for my own continued leadership. But that would have been begging, and I was done begging. On the 1st of December, I submitted my resignation. Not an advisory transition, not a gradual handoff, a resignation effective immediately. I sent the letter to Richard, to the board of directors, and to every department head in the company. I was professional, courteous, and absolutely clear. I was leaving, and I was not coming back. Richard called me within 15 minutes. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice was shaking, with anger or fear, I couldn't tell. "I'm resigning," I said calmly. "It's in the letter." "You can't resign. We have an agreement. We had a conversation. I agreed to transition Thomas into the role, which I've done to the best of my ability. I never agreed to remain in an advisory capacity. Check the record if you'd like." There was a long silence. I could hear him breathing, recalibrating. "Listen," he said, his tone shifting to something he probably thought was conciliatory. "Let's not be hasty. We can talk about this. Maybe we were too aggressive with the timeline. Maybe there's a role for you." "Richard." I cut him off. "I'm going to explain something to you, and I want you to listen carefully. The software running your supply chain management is licensed from my consulting firm. That license expires in 90 days. You can renew it, but the renewal terms will be different. More silence. The contracts with your top 15 suppliers include review clauses triggered by changes in key personnel. My departure qualifies. Those suppliers will be reaching out to renegotiate terms. They'll be negotiating with Thomas, I assume. I heard something like a gasp. Finally, I've documented certain financial irregularities in the Vietnam operation. I have not shared this documentation with anyone yet, but I've arranged for it to be delivered to the board and to appropriate regulatory authorities in the event that anything unfortunate happens to my reputation, my family, or my interests. You're blackmailing me. His voice was barely a whisper. No, Richard. Blackmail would be asking for something in return. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just leaving. What happens after I leave is not my concern, I hung up. The next few months were strange. I'd expected to feel triumphant, victorious, vindicated. Instead, I felt mostly empty. I rented a small office downtown, nothing fancy, just a room with a desk and a window that looked out onto the street. I started my own consulting firm, reaching out to the contacts I'd made over the years. Work came in, slowly at first, then faster as word spread that I was available. Within 6 months, I had more clients than I could handle. I watched Harrington Industrial Solutions from a distance. The supply chain software struggled without my oversight. Thomas couldn't understand the maintenance requirements, and the IT team I'd trained had mostly quit. The supplier contracts fell into chaos. Huang Wei called me personally to say he'd moved his business elsewhere, that he trusted me but not the boy. The Vietnam situation exploded when an internal audit turned up the discrepancies I had documented. Marcus was quietly forced out, and the company took a $40 million write-down. Stock price dropped 30% in 6 months. The board began asking questions. Richard held on for a while, insisting that Thomas just needed time, but the numbers told a different story. I didn't intervene. I didn't gloat. I just watched. Margaret and I separated that spring. It wasn't dramatic. No screaming matches, no revelations, no moment of crisis. We'd simply grown too far apart to pretend otherwise. She'd known, I think, that I was unhappy long before I'd admitted it to myself. And she'd known on some level that her family had treated me badly. She just hadn't been able to acknowledge it, because acknowledging it would have meant questioning everything she'd grown up believing. I always thought you'd stay, she said, the night we decided to end it. I thought you'd just keep going, keep making it work. I know, I said. I thought so too. Do you hate us? My family? I considered the question carefully. No, I feel sorry for you, I think. You've never had to build anything. You've just had to not lose what someone else built. That's a different kind of life. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I loved you. I want you to know that. In my way. I know, I said again. I loved you too. In my way. The divorce was amicable, or at least as amicable as these things can be. We split custody of the kids, 2 weeks with me, 2 weeks with her. I bought a small house near the office, filled it with secondhand furniture and books I'd never had time to read. It wasn't much, but it was mine. A year after my resignation, I got a call from Richard. I almost didn't answer. But something, curiosity maybe, or a lingering connection to the life I'd left behind, made me pick up. I need to talk to you, he said. His voice was different, smaller somehow. In person. We met at a coffee shop near my office. He looked older than I remembered. Grayer, more stooped, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He ordered a black coffee and sat across from me, stirring it for a long time before speaking. I'm stepping down, he said finally. The board asked for my resignation. I nodded but said nothing. Thomas, he's not ready. I see that now. He'll never be ready. He laughed, a bitter sound. My father always said the third generation ruins everything. I thought we'd be different. What do you want, Richard? He looked at me, and for the first time in all the years I'd known him, I saw something like honesty in his eyes. I want to know how you did it. How you built what you built from nothing. I've been thinking about it, trying to understand. You came in with no degree, no connections, no money, and you created something. Something real. While I was playing golf and going to board meetings and taking credit for things I didn't understand. I took a sip of my coffee, thinking about how to answer. I had nothing to lose, I said finally. That's the secret if there is one. When you start with nothing, risk feels different. You're not afraid of falling, because you've already hit the bottom. You just climb. And now? Do you have something to lose now? I thought about my children, my small house, my growing business, the relationships I was rebuilding, the life I was constructing piece by piece. Now I have something to protect, I said. It's different. Not better or worse, just different. Richard nodded slowly. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the table. What's this? A letter, an apology. I know it doesn't fix anything, but he trailed off. I was wrong about you, about a lot of things I wanted you to know. I picked up the envelope, but didn't open it. Thank you. We sat in silence for a moment, two men on opposite sides of a divide that had taken years to create and would take years to fully understand. What happens to the company? I asked. Board's bringing in outside management, professional CEO, new operations team. They're talking about a complete restructure. He smiled weakly. Thomas is going back to school. Getting an MBA, he says. I don't know if it'll help, but it might, I said. People can change, even people who've never had to. Richard stood up, leaving his coffee mostly untouched. I should go. Thank you for meeting with me. Richard? He stopped, murmuring back. I hope it works out. For the company, for your family, I hope Thomas figures it out. He looked surprised, maybe even moved. You mean that? I do. I spent 12 years of my life building that company. I don't want to see it fail. I just couldn't be the one holding it up anymore. He nodded once, then walked out of the coffee shop into the gray afternoon. I opened the letter that night, sitting alone in my small house with a glass of whiskey I probably shouldn't have been drinking. The letter was handwritten. I could tell Richard had struggled with it, crossing out words, starting over, trying to find language for something he'd never had to express. I underestimated you from the beginning, he wrote. I saw what I expected to see. Someone to use. Someone beneath us. Someone who should be grateful for whatever we gave. I never saw you for what you were, what you built, what you deserved. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not even sure I'm asking for it. I just wanted to say that I know now what I didn't know then. You were never trash. You were the only real thing in a building full of pretense. I'm sorry. I read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it in a drawer. I didn't know what to feel. Anger, maybe that it had taken him this long. Satisfaction that he finally understood. Sadness for the years I'd spent trying to prove something to people who would never value it. Mostly, I felt tired. 2 years have passed since that meeting with Richard. The company, it's not called Harrington Industrial Solutions anymore. The new management rebranded it, survived. Smaller than it was, different than it was, but functional. Thomas, against all expectations, turned out to be a halfway decent student. He sends me emails sometimes asking questions about supply chain management or operations theory. I answer them. Margaret remarried last year. A nice man, an architect, someone without history or baggage or complicated connections into her family. I went to the wedding, our kids were in the ceremony, and it was fine. Not painful, just a thing that happened, a chapter closing. My business has grown. I've hired a small team now, 6 people who remind me of myself at their age. Hungry, smart, unpolished. I try to give them what no one gave me: recognition, credit, a path forward. Some of them will leave eventually, go on to build their own things. That's as it should be. Last month, I was invited to speak at a business school. The same school I dropped out of 30 years ago. They wanted me to talk about entrepreneurship, about building something from nothing, about resilience in the face of adversity. I stood at the podium looking out at a room full of students, and I thought about all the things I could tell them. The strategies, the tactics, the secrets of success, the importance of systems thinking, of relationship building, of protecting yourself from people who would use you and discard you. Instead, I told them this: you will work for people who don't value you. It's almost guaranteed. They'll take credit for your work, dismiss your contributions, treat you like a tool instead of a person. And you'll wonder if it's worth it, if you should just give up, if you should become like them. Don't. Not because you'll always win. Sometimes the bad guys win. Sometimes the system is rigged. Sometimes merit doesn't matter. but because who you become in the process is more important than what you achieve. Build something real. Build something that matters. Build something that no one can take away from you, even if they take everything else. I spent 12 years building a company for people who never saw me as an equal. In the end, they tried to throw me away. But the skills I developed, the relationships I formed, the knowledge I gained, those came with me when I left. The company they kept was hollow without them. So work hard, yes. Be strategic, yes. Protect yourself, yes. But also be kind when you can. Give credit where it's due. And never forget that the people you're building with matter more than the thing you're building. The people who saw me as trash did me a favor in the end. They showed me what I was really worth. And it was more than they ever imagined. I still have dinner with my kids every Sunday night. We cook together, something I never had time for when I was running Harrington. And we talk about their lives, their struggles, their dreams. My son wants to be an engineer. My daughter wants to write novels. Neither of them wants to go into business. And I've told them that's fine, more than fine. Last Sunday, my daughter asked me about the company. She was too young to understand what happened when I left, but she's been piecing it together from overheard conversations and things she's read online. "Were you angry?" she asked. "When Grandpa Richard told you to leave?" I thought about it, about the dinner where he'd announced Thomas's promotion, about the study where he'd called me trash, about all the years I'd spent proving myself to people who would never see past their own assumptions. I was, I said, for a while. And now? I looked out the window at the small garden I'd planted last spring. Tomatoes, cucumbers, herbs that were just starting to come up. Nothing like the manicured grounds of the Harrington estate, but mine. Now I'm grateful, I said. If they'd valued me, I might have stayed forever. I would have kept building their company, kept being their secret weapon, kept being invisible. They did what I couldn't do for myself. They set me free. She considered this, chewing on a piece of bread. "That's weird," she said finally. "Being grateful to someone for being terrible to you?" "Maybe," I agreed, "but life is weird. People are complicated. Sometimes the worst things that happen to you turn out to be the best things, and you don't see it until later. Do you think they know? The Harringtons? Do they know what they lost?" I smiled, thinking of Richard's letter, of Thomas's emails, of the company struggling to rebuild what I'd built. I think they're starting to figure it out. I don't know what the future holds. My business might grow or might stay small. My kids might struggle or might thrive. When the world will keep turning, full of people who underestimate and dismiss and discard each other, full of people who rise and fall and rise again. What I know is this. I built something once, something real and lasting, and I can do it again. Not for the recognition, not for the money, not to prove anything to anyone. Just because building is what I do. It's who I am. They called me trash. They said I was nothing. They thought they were doing me a favor by giving me scraps from their table. They had no idea. They had no idea that the skills I developed in their company were mine to keep, that the relationships I built would follow me wherever I went, that the mind they dismissed as merely operational was capable of seeing patterns and possibilities they would never understand. They had no idea that when they threw me away, they were throwing away the only thing that made them valuable, the only thing that separated them from 100 other inherited companies slowly sliding into irrelevance. They had no idea that the dropout they picked from the trash was the best thing that ever happened to them, and that losing me was the worst. But I knew. And in the end, that was enough. I got a package last week. No return address, just my name written in careful script on the brown paper wrapping. Inside was a framed photograph, the one that used to hang in Richard's study, showing the company headquarters on the day it moved into its new building. I'm in the corner of the photo, barely visible, half hidden behind a pillar. I remember that day. I remember thinking that I was just getting started, that the best was yet to come. With the photo was a note, in handwriting I didn't recognize. Found this when we were cleaning out the estate. Now, Dad always talked about this picture, about how everything that came after started here. I think he meant it one way, and I'm coming to understand it another. Thank you for answering my questions. I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to be better than what I was raised to be. Thomas, I hung the photo in my office, next to the window where the light is best. Sometimes I look at it and try to remember the man I was. Young, hungry, desperate to prove himself to people who would never be capable of seeing him clearly. I'm not that man anymore. I'm not sure I want to be. But I'm grateful to him. Grateful for his work, his sacrifice, his stubborn refusal to give up. Grateful for the foundation he laid that allows me to stand here now in a life I built for myself. Surrounded by people who know my worth because I know it too. The best revenge, they say, is living well. I don't think of it as revenge. I think of it as becoming the person I was always meant to be, without the weight of other people's expectations, without the constraints of a world that tried to define me by where I came from instead of where I was going. I'm still building. I'll always be building, and no one will ever throw me away again.